Madam Secretary, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is such a pleasure to welcome you all at the Czech Embassy on this, and then there was the word gorgeous day. It's no longer a gorgeous day, it began raining, but I am sincerely happy that you're here, and in spite of the rain, that we will have such a great time. It's always a great honor for us to host our dear friends here. And today, we are hosting not only a dear friend, but I dare say a more kind of a member of our family. Family histories are always shared within families. This is what in fact makes real families, what keeps them, binds them together. And we are so fortunate that we have Madam Secretary in our family, and that with her latest book, she tells a story which is very much our common story. I was delighted to hear that Madeleine's American family, like her Czech family, has decided to recognize her as one of the most distinguished members. The recent decision of President Obama to award Madeleine with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, like late President Havel's decision 15 years ago to bestow on her the Order of White Lion First Class, only confirms that both her American and Czech families cherish and respect her in the same way. I'm so glad that it's been possible for us to team up with the Aspen Institute, another great friend of ours, to put together this event. I very much look forward to the discussion, even though it might bring a bit of sadness and a chill. And again, there was this a very hot day, which again, it was written today morning, and it was looking to be a hot day, but again, I think that it's not going to be that hot inside. But as it may, from an occasional chill of the past, we will be able to walk out into the warm air of the present. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a heartfelt welcome to Walter Isaacson and Madam Secretary Madeleine Albright.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you so much for your help with Aspen Prague. With Madeleine Albright's help, your help, Fred Malik and others, Aspen Prague was voted on at our last board meeting to be the latest in Aspen's plan for world domination, and we can't think of a more fun place to do it. In order to celebrate that, in mid-July, Secretary Albright is bringing her Council of Former Foreign Ministers to be part of the kickoff there, and so that'll be pretty exciting. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary, for being here. The book interweaves, as we biographers love to see happen, the personal and the historical. And very rarely do you get up that close with the real values of history. And I really commend this book. It'll be for sale afterwards. But it's not only a book about history, it's not only a book about a personal journey, but it's a book about values, the values of realism, of love, of family, of loyalty, of telling truth. And so it's a spectacular book. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much. And Ambassador, thank you very much. And I am delighted to be here. I have come here obviously many times, and one of the major times was in February 1990 when we liberated the embassy, got rid of all the ugly art, and then brought in some of the wonderful new Velvet Revolution. I'm also very happy that my family's here. This is very much their story. My sister Kathy and my brother John, my sister-in-law Pamela, and then two very special people, Thomas Kraus, who is was really
a hero of the book.
Right. Person that led us through the story, and Mark Talisman, who also was very much a part of it. But there's so many people that have been a part of it, and so this is a different kind of audience. I do feel very, very much at home here, so thank you.
How did you end up, how did you start writing this book? What was prompted it?
Well, the thing that happened, and just to put it all into context, I start the book by saying that I was 59 years old when I found out I wasn't who I thought I was, and really had to dig into my personal identity. And what happened, I had obviously had jobs and things in Washington, but I didn't become a public figure until I became ambassador of the United Nations. And there were a number of different profiles about me, and all of a sudden people started sending me letters. Some people wanted money, some people wanted visas, but mostly it was in letters in Czech and also in indecipherable handwriting that would say things like, we knew your family, and then somebody would say, I went to high school with your father in 1915, which would have been impossible since he was born in 1909, and so kind of mixed up things. Then in November of '96, I got a letter that had all the facts right, that had the names of the towns, the dates right, the family names right, and it said, and we knew these families to be very fine Jewish families. So it was just the time that I was being vetted to be Secretary of State, and I was in the White House counsel's office, and they asked me the normal questions like, have you paid your taxes and do you have a nanny and things like that. And so, and then ultimately they said, is there anything about you that we didn't ask that we should know? And I said, well, I've just gotten this information, and chances are pretty good that I am of Jewish origin. And they said, so what? The president isn't anti-Semitic. So then what happened was that you know this, is that reporters, somebody who's been named to office can't talk to a journalist until you're confirmed. And so then Michael Dobbs, who was working on a profile of me for the Washington Post, wanted to do a profile. We gave him names of a variety of people. Mark, I think you were among them, and various people that might know something. And he, on the day that I was confirmed, came back into my office and started presenting me with photographs and documents. The Nazis were very organized, and so they had these little cards that actually Tomáš had been able to provide them of what the names of the transports, the numbers of the transports, and all of a sudden he says, do you know how many of your family died in the Holocaust? And I was taken completely aback and tried to in my own mind, try to figure out what happened. And the only way I can describe it, Walter, is that it's like having been asked to represent my country in a marathon, the first time that a woman had done that, and then be given a really, really heavy package, and then told to unwrap it while I ran. And so that's when I asked Kathy and John and Pam to go to the Czech Republic. They met with Tomáš, and they kind of went through and began to lay out the framework of the story. I then, after years, really did want to go back and look at it more carefully and understand all the aspects of it and put it within that historical setting and in that moral dilemma setting. So that's how I started. I did go back physically. I went to England to look at places where we'd lived during the war, and then also back in the Czech Republic. And then what was interesting was the Foreign Ministry gave me my father's personnel files. And then they had, obviously there were a lot of secret police records from the immediately after the war. And what had happened was they were in an institute for the study of totalitarianism. So they gave me my father's secret police records. Many, many times in it, it said he was a pro-Western Democrat. So they didn't like him. So the bottom line is that's how it started.
Mm-hmm. And you found some boxes. You have to sort of go through the boxes of papers.
The problem, I think I should be on that program of pack rats or whatever.
Yeah.
But what had happened was that I had some boxes. Some boxes were all moved around when diplomatic security moved into my garage, and various aspects. And so finally I did find some boxes in which I found a variety of things.
Is that with the novel?
The novel. What we had known that our father had been writing a novel, but who would have thought? I mean, he was a historian, a political scientist. He'd written a number of books on to do with Czechoslovakia or a book about Poland between East and West or on Kashmir or on Tito, but somehow the idea that he would write a novel didn't make much sense. And so I then found the novel, and it forms a very important part of the story in terms of it is about a person, a young Czechoslovak diplomat who comes back after the war and doesn't find his family. And so I think it picks up a lot of the questions or deals with some
There's
of
a
the
wonderful line in it near the end, which you write about near the end of your book, which is always be
true to yourself.
right. Do you
And-
think he was talking about his Jewish identity?
No, I think he was talking about his identity as a Czechoslovak and as a humanist, and of somebody that was in fact true to the values that he had grown up with, which were about being a patriot, somebody who understood the fragility of democracy, who understood the value of the individual. That is the way that I understood it.
But tell us a little bit about your father, because this is where the personal connects with the historical.
Right.
He's part of Mazarak.
Right.
And, yeah.
Well, I think our parents were, first of all, I think most of the people in this room know it, but Czechoslovakia was a new country in 1918, created out of the falling apart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and and very much linked to the United States in terms of a relationship with Woodrow Wilson, and then Thomas Garrigue Masaryk was the embodiment of Czechoslovakia. He had a Slovak father and a mother who was a Czech Moravian, and he married an American, Charlotte Garrigue, and he did something in the last quarter of the 19th century, which I think many people would find hard to believe today. He took his wife's maiden name as his middle name. So he married Charlotte Garrigue, and he became Thomas Garrigue Masaryk. The Czechoslovak Constitution in many ways is modeled on the American one, with a significant exception in that it has equal rights language in it in 1918. And so,
We don't have that
no,
yet, do
not
we?
quite. And so the thing that happened was there was this new country, and our parents were part of the generation that was going to build this country. They were born in 1909 and 1910. My father wanted to be a diplomat. He went to Charles University, and then he studied at the Sorbonne. And his first assignment was as the Czechoslovak press attaché in Belgrade. And then he was recalled and was in Prague when the Nazis marched in. And then I think the sense of patriotism was really one of wanting to be with the government in exile in London. I think they'd had, I imagine many people in this room know better than I, but basically Prague must have been amazing during the 20s and 30s in terms of Art Deco and fun and cafe society, and really amazing place. And I think from that, all of a sudden they escaped and they lived in England. We were in England during the war, during the Blitz.
That's where you went to school.
That's where I went to school, and he broadcast for the BBC into Czechoslovakia, the resistance movement. And then they came back with the government in May 1945, and he was then a couple of months later sent to be ambassador in Yugoslavia, where he was until 1948, when his last assignment, because he'd been there the kind of normal 3 years that diplomats are, of representing Czechoslovakia on a panel, on a commission on India and Pakistan over Kashmir. I often say, he's dead, I'm old, and the problem is worse than ever.
Right.
But he was persuaded, then the coup happened in February 48. He was persuaded by his best friends, the British and American ambassadors, to take the job and come to the United States, which he did, and we arrived in the United States in November 1948. He then finished what he was doing and defected and asked for political asylum. When I became secretary, they gave me a copy of a letter that he had written to Dean Acheson, in which he said, I beg for asylum. He was granted that, and then one of the things I now understand, the Rockefeller Foundation at the time was funding people such as him to be somewhere, teach somewhere, and they sent him, they found a job in Denver. We had no idea where Denver was. My parents bought a car, they stuck us in the back, we were driving, and my mother kept saying, they say Denver's the mile-high city, but we're not going up, so maybe we're going the wrong direction. But anyway, they loved Denver, and my mother used to say regularly, there are only two great cities in the world, Prague and Denver.
Whoa.
Yeah, but
I've been to both.
You've been to both. But then also, I mean, we are very good friends, but there also is an association because when Aspen started, they used local professors from the University of Denver and University of Colorado, and that's when we all, as a family, started going to Aspen. So there's
I think
that
it's
connection
amazing
too.
that in 1949, 1950, when you're arriving, 1951, right when Aspen is starting, Professor Joseph Corbell becomes
Right.
a resource fellow
Yeah.
of the Aspen Institute.
Yeah.
And now, to veer from the book for a moment, we have the Joseph Corbell School
At
that
the University
opened
of
a
Denver,
year or
right,
two ago.
yeah.
And there's a big celebration for those of us in Aspen in mid-August,
Right.
So people can buy
We're very,
tickets.
very interrelated in this
Exactly.
way. Yeah.
Now, to go back to the historical part, you mentioned T.G. Masaryk, right? His son, Jan Masaryk,
Yeah.
becomes an important part of the story, but also dies, commits suicide, whatever,
No,
killed by
killed.
Stalin.
Yeah.
You say in the book you're convinced he was killed by...
Right.
So why don't you, because that's the...
Well, it's very interesting because Jan Masaryk was the son of TGM, and he was initially, well, he had an American mother and somebody that was very much prized within Czechoslovakia. The president, after TGM died, was Eduard Beneš, and Jan Masaryk then became, at a certain stage, the ambassador in Great Britain. So he was in London all through the war, and then after the war he was made foreign minister. And somebody that kind of embodied the spirit of Czechoslovakia and his father, very different from his father. I think that people that have read about Thomas Masaryk and have seen his photographs know that he was meant to be president. Just the way you look, he could have been, people said he should have been president of the world, the way, and a very dedicated and brilliant humanist. His son had kind of more pleasure in life and had I think a bon vivant kind of spirit, played the piano, composed songs, and was also somebody that had traveled a great deal, very knowledgeable about the West. He was foreign minister at a time when Czechoslovakia, along with other countries, had been invited to be a part of the Marshall Plan. And they had accepted to be part of it. And then they go to Moscow and they're told by Stalin, you're not going to do it.
That's the beginning of the Cold
At
War.
the beginning, and what he basically, Masaryk came back and said, I know that I am not the foreign minister of a sovereign country. He was part of the government. He used to come, well, my father, when he was ambassador to Yugoslavia, you know, the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, I did that for a living. And so, I remember asking my father why when Jan Masaryk arrived, he always had his right arm in a sling. And my father said, because he won't shake hands with the communists. But he had a very complicated role in being a non-party person within the government. I'm sure that other people have been there. He had an apartment in the foreign ministry. He lived there, and one of the things he then I've gone through this material now many times. Czechs are big at defenestration, throwing people out of windows. And so what happened was that he was found in the courtyard of the foreign ministry. Some people speculated that he'd committed suicide. My mother never believed that. And later, I think, as they've gone through a variety of investigations on it, I think it becomes clearer and clearer that he was murdered.
It's in 48, because
48.
everything in Czechoslovakia that's important ends in a year with A, as you say in the book.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
tell us, to get back to the personal, if we may, how, when you went over there, you intersected with the history of this period, which is what, 1937 to 48? Yeah.
Well, and when, just now?
Yeah.
Well, I think partially it is a fascinating period in terms of, as somebody who has studied history and been a political scientist and had something to do with decision making, kind of look at that period and try to figure out what exactly happened here. And part of it was the fact that, and I hadn't focused on this enough before, is that the British and French were very tired from World War I. I think that they really bore the scars of World War I in a way that that I think people hadn't focused on. They tried very, very hard not to have World War I happen. And so they then, I think, did not take into consideration enough what kind of a person Hitler was, and they kept feeding the beast and thinking that if they gave him first the Saarland and then various aspects of various parts of other countries, they could appease him. The word appeasement is definitely to this period. And so the thing that comes out of it, for me, is how large nations make decisions over the head of small countries. Czechoslovakia, no Czechoslovak representative was present at Munich, and Munich becomes kind of the symbol of appeasement and giving in. And I think there are many lessons out of this. The other is Czechoslovakia, in many ways, was a multi-ethnic country. Czechs and Slovaks and a large German minority, and then a Hungarian minority, and then Subcarpathian Ruthenians at the end, and various titles of borders that were not very clear. One of my really good friends, Adam Daniel Rotfeld, the former foreign minister of Poland, is here, and a good friend of mine, and we've talked about in terms of some of the border issues that Czechoslovakia had with Poland. And so, as in fact, Hitler, there were people that were dissatisfied, especially in the German minority, that then in fact began to agitate to get more rights and became a way that Hitler had an inroad into Czechoslovakia.
One of the more powerful parts of the book is you piecing together and then retelling the story of Terezin. And how did you come to, I mean, what was it like to research that?
Well, I mean, first of all, and again, Tomáš had a huge role in this. I think anybody that hasn't gone to Prague and goes to Prague has to go and see the center of the Jewish community in Prague. And that there is a catalog with all these different cards of people, whatever their fate was, everything written down. And so we began the research. My brother and sister obviously had a huge role in this in terms of beginning to put the pieces together. And then the idea was, the last time I went, going to Terezin itself is in many ways the most kind of barbaric, masochistic place because it looks so nice. I mean, that is what's so crazy. It's two places. It's a fortress that actually was built as during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is a prison. And Gavrilo Princip, who assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, was there. And then there was a garrison town that looks very pleasant, a nice green square and nice buildings. And initially it had been portrayed to Jews as a spa, a place that they knew that as the war began, that they would be isolated in many different ways. And so some of them actually decided that they would go to Terezin. So going there now, it's completely empty and completely spooky because you can just visualize and you can, if you go through the place, I had the feeling that you could hear voices and kind of the ghosts of Terezin, and it's a horrible, horrible story. And then as part of the sadomasochistic part, they ran the place with very few Germans, and what they did was to have a group of Jewish elders whose job it was then to select the other Jews that were supposed to go on to Auschwitz. Terezin was not a death camp, though people did die there of disease. One of my grandfathers died there of typhoid. And so, in fact, it was, and they had schools, they had so much talent there that they had their own symphony orchestra, they put on plays. And so in some ways it was even, it's impossible to rate sadism, but in fact making it look so normal. And then the thing they did, and I keep trying to pull lessons out of this, the Nazis, there was a request by the International Red Cross to go and examine this place. And the Nazis knew that they were coming. They in fact got ready for the visit by this Red Cross group, which was either not composed of the right people or the people had not done their homework, but the bottom line is they had set up parts of the camp to look perfectly nice, like locker rooms, etc. They show it to you now when you go. And what happened was this particular group gave them a clean bill of health. And as we these days talk about monitors and various places that go into somewhere, there are real lessons about that you have to know what you're looking for. You have to ask questions. You can't be led around by the information officers or whatever. I mean, there are lessons. This was one of the disasters, was in fact the fact that they gave them a clean bill of health.
Tell me about the process of your parents converting to Catholicism and then you finding out about that process.
Well, part of the thing is I grew up a Roman Catholic. We were baptized as a family. By the way, the hardest part is separating what I knew then and what I have discovered. I grew up as a Roman Catholic. I became an Episcopalian when I got married and I found out I was Jewish. So, you know, but the bottom line is that from the records I have learned that we were baptized as a family in May 1941. And my parents died before I found any of this out. Therefore, everything is based on speculation. And I think that's the hard part. All I have to go on, and we have talked about this a lot, is knowing what we know about our parents, trying to speculate generally what happened. And I think the following. First of all, this was in England. We were living in England. We had gone there in 1939. So it isn't as if they converted in order to escape the Holocaust. They were out. I think also it wasn't to fool their friends who knew they were Jewish. And so why? And I think part of it has to do with our mother being a fairly spiritual kind of person, having a very good friend who was a Roman Catholic. And I think then that they chose it as because it seemed safer, I imagine, to protect the children. That is my best evaluation of it. I think one other thing that is interesting in the records that I got is on their wedding certificate, under religion, they put bez vyznání, which means without confession. So I don't think they ever were particularly religious. And then the other part, again, Tomáš has helped to explain this in many ways, is that Czechoslovak Jews were probably the most assimilated Jews, and in many ways a community. I mean, we grew up with Christmas trees and talking about Easter, so did you. And so I think that there was a profile in some ways where they were secular, very secular Jews. And so that is the way that I see it. But it's very hard to speculate. I also, knowing what our parents were really like, my sense is that had this happened years later when they knew that 6 million Jews had been exterminated, they would not have done that.
Mm-hmm. You refer to your book as sort of three layers: the personal layer upon which is the historical layer, and then a grand moral layer to it. Let's end, before we go to the audience, with the grand moral layer. And I remember once, I'll be name dropping and place dropping, but at your house, was it you invited me over for dinner, and President Havel was there, Václav Havel, who is a spiritual spirit and the saint, the ghost in this book, throughout the book. And he said then at dinner, something you paraphrase here in the book too, which is that there are two types of people: those with the souls of collaborationists and those who speak truth to power. And he was obviously in the latter camp, but that's not always easy.
I think the thing that I learned out of this is that there's a little bit of both in everybody. And I think that the question is that none of us quite know how we would really behave. And there are a number of different stories, and I think one, it's going to take me a few minutes to talk about, but I think showed some of this. One of the most amazing events of the war was the assassination of Heydrich, the Reichsprotector. Mm-hmm. The man
this is 70 years ago.
70 years ago, just now. And he was actually the inventor of the Holocaust, of the final solution. And there were issues. The question was what to do about him. And one of the really difficult decisions that the government in exile had to make was to try to figure out whether it was possible to assassinate him. And there were already then hint, obviously, that there would be some kind of retribution if that happened. Anyway, there was this, and I've been told it's a real page turner within the book, is
Yes.
in terms of a group of some parachutists that came from London and then go and they assassinate Heydrich. And there are people within that story, some of whom are unbelievably brave. A woman, Mrs. Moravec, who protected people. And then there were those who actually, in the end, a parachutist that had joined them, denounced them to get money, a reward. And then there were people kind of in the middle who were asked about where they were or had to do the translating when they were being questioned. And so there are people kind of in the middle in terms of how they behave. And I think that the bottom line is, and then the decision itself, and I think this continues to be disputed, as a result of the Heydrich assassination, the Germans decide to level a whole town, Lidice. And there are people that blame Beneš and the government exile for making a decision like that, that would in fact, thousands of people died because Heydrich's assassination. On the other hand, because of the assassination, this was the only assassination of a high-level Nazi, it was one of the reasons, and probably the final reason, that the British recognized the government in exile. They saw all of a sudden what brave people they were and that they needed to be those that represented a new Czechoslovakia.
And he was scheduled to go on to Paris, right?
And he was to do bigger and better holocausts. And so the bottom line is that this was a very important aspect of the story. Now, there are various coincidences out of that. One of them, again, Tamás's father, who was a journalist, who then was sent to Lidice to bury people, and he survived. Then, that is a better story. Then what I didn't realize is that our grandmother, they were rounding up Jews right after that, and a day after Heydrich died, they rounded up, she was sent to Terezin.
And so that might have even been connected, which causes you the complexity.
The complexity of it, and that it's very easy to make judgments, but there are very few issues that are black and white. And that, and the question is, I do believe that there's a duality in all of us in terms of the good and the bad. And the question is, and none of us quite know how we would behave if you are told you can save your family if you rat on your neighbor, when you know that if you don't rat on the neighbor, the next guy's going to rat on the neighbor. So I think
it's not only a duality, though, in that respect. There is sort of a realism, idealism. It is a complicated world, but you end the book by saying, even though it is complicated, and even though there are many nuances, I still believe that we have to search for the right and wrong.
Absolutely. And in many ways, it's that journey that is part of it, of trying to sort out how you behave, what is moral behavior, how do you operate. And you know, it's very hard to find perfect truth, but the bottom line is that search, is the journey.
But there is a truth, and that search for it is the useful part of, to me, the core lesson of that book, both personal, political, and historical, is the search and the search for the truth and what that does to us as people.
I think that's right.
Let me open it up to some questions, if I may. Marge Sonnenfeld, who went with you once to Prague, right?
Right, yes.
Is it on now?
Yeah, just keep talking, they'll get you.
Thank you, Madeleine, for those remarks. It was very moving. I remember that you and I were in a small group of Americans who went to Prague. It must have been spring, summer of 1991, before you were, as you described yourself, a public personality, and certainly before you learned about your family background. I think it may have been your first trip back to Prague since your childhood, and you showed us where you had lived, and we met with Havel, and I think it was the foreign minister, who was called the Stoker because that had been his job in the prison in which he had been imprisoned. I also remember that you personally gave an award to Havel in the Prague castle one afternoon during our visit, and I wonder if you could describe your own feelings about going back and meeting these new leaders who had
Yeah.
survived and suffered and triumphed.
I had actually gone back once before in 1967 with my American husband, American name, American passport, and had been told, as it turns out erroneously, that my father had been tried in absentia. That is true. I had been told at that time that he'd been sentenced to death, which he hadn't been, as I've now gone through the records. But it certainly made me uncomfortable about going there. And so I went back a number of times in the 80s under the auspices of USIA. I have to tell this story because they were trying to prove, some of you may, back in the early 80s, they had, all of a sudden a list came out saying that there were certain people that the USIA would never send abroad, and since my name began with an A, I was the first on the list. And then they were trying to prove that such a list did not exist. And if there was such a list, it was only that somebody had suggested that Albright go to Nigeria to talk about crop rotation, which would have not been my expertise. So anyway, in order to prove that the list didn't exist, I went every summer to, because I was studying changes in communist systems, to various communist countries and under the auspices of USIA. So I was in Czechoslovakia in the 80s. But the 90s, it was really amazing. I had met Jiří Dienstbier, who became the foreign minister, while I was working on my dissertation, which was on the role of the Czechoslovak press in 1968. And Jiří Dienstbier was in the United States because he had managed to keep Radio Prague on the air during the Soviet invasion, and they had wanted, in fact, avoiding everybody over here, they had wanted, in fact, to protect him, so he was here. He then went back, and ultimately he was arrested and stoked furnaces, and I went back in January 1990 as vice chairman of the National Democratic Institute. And President Havel knew that he was going to meet with some American delegation. We were in the castle, and I handed him my father's book on 20th century Czechoslovakia, and he said, "I know who you are. You're Mrs. Fulbright." And I said, "No, I'm Mrs. Albright." So I said, "Well, is there anything we can do to help you?" And he said, "We need a new electoral law." And so NDI managed to get experts there within 3 or 4 days to help write this electoral law. But the other thing that happened was that his advisors were there, and being in the castle at that point, I mean, they all were wearing black jeans and black turtlenecks and riding around on scooters and listening to rock and roll but anyway, they said, "Well, we have to set up the presidential office. Can you help us set it up?" So I went with the advisors to a restaurant up near the St. Vitus Cathedral. I was drawing charts of how presidential offices look, and then I had to walk from the castle down to the hotel where I was on Wenceslas Square, and I literally had an out-of-body experience as I was walking across Charles Bridge. It was snowing. And I thought, I've never left here. This is where I belong. And then I thought, I would not have known what a presidential office looked like if I hadn't been in America. And then what happened was that they all came to the United States because it was Havel's trip here and addressing Congress. And Martin Palos and other people were part of that group. We were up on the hill up there, and Havel, we were getting ready for the trip, and Rita Klimova, who'd been the first Velvet Revolution ambassador here, we were sitting there, and I, to this day, am the perfect staffer. So we'd done the outline of the trip and Q's and A's, and Havel turns to the people and he says, "So this is an advisor." And then Rita and I actually helped to translate the speech that he was going to give to the joint session, and we were practicing down at Blair House, and he's reading it, and he said, "This is not my word. I never would have used this word. I'm not going to speak in English." And then he gave his speech in Czech with Michael Žantovský translating. But the meeting Havel was the most amazing thing. And the fact that we ended up as friends is beyond belief to me, and we really did. I spent a lot of time with him, and he was one of the guiding spirits of so much, and And I think that what he did to make all of us proud again of being Czechoslovaks or Czechs and Slovaks is immeasurable. I think, I don't know how many, we're all very similar here. I think it was very hard to be a Czechoslovak during the Cold War. I mean, I literally, people would say, the Poles have revolts every 5 minutes. The Hungarians are revolting. Where are you people?
Right.
And I really do think that Havel kind of gave the spirit back to the country and is owed a great, great debt by everybody speaking truth to power.
Absolutely. Let me, by the way, let me give a shout out to Alma Gildenhorn, who sponsors these book series and lunch series for the Aspen Institute, and seems to have found a new venue for them other than the Gildenhorn room. Yeah, I think you had your hand up right there, if you would, and I'll try to catch back. Yeah.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, my name is Judith Trumkus, and I'm a PhD student of cultural diplomacy. And my question has to do with your cultural discoveries that you have made while you were discovering your family's heritage. I was wondering personally, which one or which ones do you think are the most valuable for you in terms of culture?
Well, you know, I am such a mixture of things. I think in terms of culture, Czechoslovak culture, I really think that a lot had to do, obviously, and these are things that I kind of set up in the book, the history of the region itself, the art and the literature. And for me, I identified in many ways most with the literature that came out of the interwar period of Karel Čapek. And I love telling people, you know, what he wrote in terms of RUR and the War of the Newts. Not this newt, another newt. But the bottom line is that kind of his capability through literature of capturing what the mood was like, obviously Franz Kafka. But what I found interesting, and I think is true, is the mixture of cultures in not just Prague, but in the whole region. And a way that speaks to the fact that even though people are very conscious of their ethnic identity, it is very hard if you know anything about Central Europe, because everybody is a little bit of something else. And so it speaks to multi-ethnicity, that the culture is something that is a combination of many different aspects. One of the things that I did do when I was secretary is talk more about cultural diplomacy. And I think it is a very important part of how a country speaks. And just to link this a little bit, in Czechoslovakia, they had a section called the jazz section. And it was built, they took me to it. And what they had, the thing they were proudest of, were copies of the Rolling Stones. And basically, the idea, this jazz section, which was a musical thing, became a political group. And the cultural aspect of music could not be stronger than anywhere in terms of Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, and the New World Symphony, and all kinds of aspects that one can draw on to speak about it. But I believe that countries can speak to each other very well through their culture. It's something that I did when I was secretary.
It's amazing how the rock music did that.
Huge.
Stoppard's plays on that.
But I have to say what was very funny was the plastic people of the universe were one of the aspects that Havel liked and really talked about it. So when we were just there October for his 75th birthday, the plastic people of the universe were there. They are still hippies with long gray hair, you know. It's
Yes, sir, and then I'll get you, but yes, sir.
Your last most wonderful exposition on the morality of all of this. I remember a photograph, if I'm correct, in Time magazine when you, I think, were then a UN ambassador, and it was a very long lens with a little sighting of a person this big with a yellow slicker on and a pitchfork in a field that was thought to be a mass grave. No one in this town would move on that issue. What prompted you? Was it this grounding, but to actually go there and do it?
First of all, I have tried to sort this out. I, in fact, did feel very, very strongly about what was going on in Bosnia before I knew of my Jewish background. It was when I was ambassador at the UN that this became something that I felt the U.S. had to do something about it. So what I think is that the value system that I grew up with And because life is so unbelievably peculiar, the fact that my father was ambassador to Yugoslavia is kind of beyond coincidence, so that I understood the area. But also something that had always stuck in my mind, and that was Munich, when people said, the British said, why should we care about people in a faraway place with unpronounceable names? So here we were again. It was a faraway land with people with unpronounceable names, and I was ambassador at the United Nations. And every day was told what were the things that were going on there. I did go, and how we finally managed to get something happening there was the following. The intelligence system in our government gave me overhead photographs, which we declassified, of the fields in Srebrenica, where in fact what had happened, there was a series of photographs that showed people in a field, then showed all of a sudden that they were gone, track marks, etc., that corroborated with a story of somebody that had been a witness there. And so we then knew what had happened in Srebrenica, and it was one of the motivating forces that we finally did go in and use force. I went back there, and it was appalling in many different ways. One, there were some farmers sitting there, and we had just found some bones, and I said, where did this come from? And they said, well, that was from World War II, which it obviously wasn't. Then how close it was to a highway. This was not somewhere in the woods, really. It was right near a highway. And then the horror of walking through fields and then trying to sort out what had happened, who had done it, and bearing witness to it. And I think it was a very important aspect of the United States getting very involved in trying to stop killings, genocidal killings. And the thing, before I went to the United Nations, and this was before President Clinton was elected, what had happened was I saw pictures on the newsreels of people being put into buses and trains that looked very much to me like the pictures that one sees about World War II. So it seemed that there was a repetition, and who would have ever thought that I would be in any position to do anything about it? And that was the story.
Go back on the other side.
It's amazing.
Remarkable
Yep.
was that they all criticized you for doing it.
Yes, well, they did.
Not all. Not all. Yes, sir.
And Stu was very much,
Ambassador Eisenstadt.
Ambassador Eisenstadt was very much a friend and partner in all this. He was Undersecretary for Economic Affairs when I was Secretary, and somebody that has, I think, had the key role in restitutions, and mostly a very, very close friend of mine. Stu, thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to suggest two moral lessons that Madeleine has taught us, I think her brother in part as well, that I saw firsthand serving as their undersecretary. The first is the shock of finding out about her past, which she shared with me right after the Michael Dobbs piece was about to come out. Some people, and we've seen some since, who try to obscure, obfuscate that past. Instead, Madeleine embraced it, as did her brother. They tried to find out everything they could, and her sister, everything they could about it. And while she was secretary, certainly was not a popular thing to do, went to Prague, found out about her grandparents, and went to the village that they came from. So that to me is an important moral lesson. The second is that she was a tremendous supporter of the Clinton administration's effort at Holocaust justice. She was supportive in every single way, and this to me is another application, in addition to the Balkans, of your past and of applying that in a very constructive way.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Mr.
Stu.
Ambassador.
Thank you.
Yeah, right here, and I think I'm going to have to make this the last question, and then we'll have the ambassador to close.
Madam Secretary, it's always an honor to hear you. I'm Cuban, and I noticed they use the word making barbarism look normal. China has been in the front pages in recent days. I'm sure many people here know about the harvesting of organs in China. I wonder what your advice would be to American policymakers dealing with a Chinese dictatorship today?
Complicated.
Well,
Today and yesterday.
today and yesterday. Well, first of all, let me take a little bit of time on this because I think it is a very important question. I believe that the U.S.-Chinese relationship is probably the key relationship for the next decade, if not longer. China all the time is described, when everybody talks about it, as rising. They are large in every way. They are resource hungry. They are finding their place in the world. And what has been going on, and it is going on as we speak, is an evolution in each administration of more in-depth relations with the Chinese. So Secretary Clinton and Secretary Geithner are there as part of strategic talks on both political and economic issues. There also are more and more military-to-military talks, I think in a way because it's essential to know what's going on. One of the lessons of my book is that leaders cannot make decisions based on wishful thinking. So Neville Chamberlain hoped that Hitler would turn out differently than he did. President Roosevelt hoped that Stalin would turn out differently. And so decisions have to be made, have to be fact-based. And the only way to do that is to have interaction with whomever. I do not consider it appeasement to talk to people we don't like. That is very different than giving in, but I think you have to know what's going on, and so that is what is happening. I also know this to be a fact, because it was true when I was secretary, and I know this secretary very well, is that you talk about everything in these meetings. Sometimes you talk very publicly, sometimes you have private meetings, but believe me, all of this is on the table. There is no question. Some to do with human rights, some on religious rights. I'm sure that there were stories about the harvesting of organs not long ago. Some on issues to do with the South China Sea, some on currency, but all these issues do come up. And I think that the responsibility now is to figure out what is the right mix in this relationship in terms of, are they enemies or are they friends? There's a stupid new word, frenemies. But the bottom line is that there are areas in which we can cooperate with the Chinese. We want to and need to cooperate with them on dealing with North Korea. We are trying to get them to be more active and effective both on Iran and on Syria. We need to figure out what are the boundaries in terms of stuff going on in the South China Sea, any number of different things. And so those are the responsibilities of the diplomats, while never forgetting that we are dealing with a communist system that, frankly, I think is going through some very interesting introspection, issues with Beaujolais and what is going on there. I have been involved in, this may surprise you, in rather peculiar talks of Democrats and Republicans with the International Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And the question is why any of us do this, and some of it, I think, is that they feel pressure at the bottom of their pyramid and they're trying to sort out what kind of things to do. They have a huge country to run. They have very serious problems, very big divisions between the rich and the poor, urban, rural, and they are going to be a major partner or adversary or whatever in the next years. And whenever there's a complicated relationship that we have, we call it multifaceted. So we have a multifaceted relationship with the Chinese.
Secretary Albright, thank you very much.
Thank you
Totally
all.
inspiring.
Thank you.
We have, I think, some out of your past, the flower girl.
Okay.
And the
I have something to do now, because from open sources we have found out that Madam Secretary is going to celebrate her birthday soon. So I think we all wish her good health and good strength to many more years.